The 1970s. America was drowning in heroin. Pure heroin flooding in from Southeast Asia, straight into black neighborhoods from Philadelphia to Detroit to Chicago. The government called it a crisis. The dealers called it business. And one man in Philadelphia saw an opportunity nobody else saw, not in the streets. In the one place nobody ever looked, the funeral home. Here's what most people don't understand about the drug trade in the 1970s. It wasn't just about violence. It was about logistics. Getting product from point A to point B without getting caught. The biggest problem every dealer faced was transportation. How do you move 50 kilos across state lines? Past roadblocks? Past drug-sniffing dogs? This man found the answer, and the answer was already dead. This wasn't some street-level corner boy. This was a man who understood systems, who understood that the best criminal empires don't look like criminal empires. They look like legitimate businesses. And in the 1970s, there was no business more legitimate, more respected, more above suspicion than a funeral home. Philadelphia, 1965. The civil rights movement at its boiling point. Riots in the streets. Police brutality at an all-time high. Black neighborhoods are economic wastelands. No jobs, no opportunity, no hope. And into this vacuum steps the drug trade, the only employer hiring, the only path to wealth for young black men, locked out of every legitimate avenue. Our subject, the streets, called him the Undertaker, born in 1942 in North Philadelphia. His father worked at a cemetery. His mother cleaned houses for white families. He was the oldest of 7. By 16, he was running numbers for the local policy racket. But here's what separated him. He was watching, learning, understanding that the men making real money weren't on the street. They were behind the scenes, the ones who controlled the infrastructure. In 1963, at 21, he got his first real break. A local funeral director needed someone to drive the hearse, someone reliable, someone who understood that in the funeral business, discretion was everything. He got the job. For 5 years, he learned every aspect of the funeral industry, how bodies were prepared, how embalming worked, how death certificates were filed, how the entire system operated, from hospital to morgue to funeral home to cemetery. And most importantly, he learned who the players were, the coroners, the morticians, the cemetery workers, the entire network of people who handled the dead, people who, by the very nature of their work, were invisible. Nobody notices the man driving the hearse. Nobody questions the funeral director. Nobody searches a coffin. In 1968, when the heroin epidemic exploded in Philadelphia, he saw his opening. The city was importing heroin at a scale never seen before. Vietnamese heroin, pure and cheap, flooding in through military connections, through the ports, and the dealers moving it were getting caught left and right. Police roadblocks, drug-sniffing dogs, undercover agents. The transportation problem was killing the business, and he realized the funeral industry had already solved the transportation problem. They moved bodies across state lines every day. They crossed borders, they went through checkpoints, and nobody ever searched a coffin. In 1969, he made his first move. He approached a small-time heroin dealer from the neighborhood, a man struggling to move product past the police roadblocks between Philadelphia and New York. "I can get your product to New York, guaranteed. No searches, no dogs, no problems." The dealer laughed until he explained the method. The dealer stopped laughing. The first shipment went out the following week. 5 kilos of pure heroin, sealed in plastic, placed inside the abdominal cavity of a deceased elderly woman, sewn back up, dressed in her finest clothes, placed in a coffin, and driven from Philadelphia to a funeral home in Harlem, past 3 police checkpoints, past drug-sniffing dogs, past every layer of security that had stopped every other dealer. The delivery was flawless. The product arrived untouched, and the dealer paid him $10,000 for a single run. $10,000 in 1969, the equivalent of nearly $80,000 today, for one trip, one coffin, one dead body. And just like that, the empire was born. By 1971, he wasn't just moving product for other dealers. He was building his own network, and he understood something devastating to law enforcement. The funeral industry was the perfect front. The point wasn't profit from funerals. The point was access. Access to bodies. Access to death certificates. Access to the entire infrastructure of death that nobody ever questioned. He bought a small funeral home in North Philadelphia, a struggling business with an aging owner who wanted to retire. He paid cash. Overnight, he became a legitimate businessman, a respected member of the community, the man who handled your grandmother's funeral, who buried your father with dignity, who stood at the graveside in a black suit, head bowed, offering comfort to grieving families. And behind closed doors, he was building something else entirely. The funeral home had a basement, where embalming happens, where bodies are prepared, where the work of death is done away from the eyes of the living. He converted that basement into a processing center. Heroin arrived from suppliers in bulk, 10, 20, 50 kilos at a time. Pure, uncut, straight from Southeast Asia. And in that basement, his team, morticians he had recruited, men who understood discretion, would process the product. Divide it into smaller packages. Seal them in multiple layers of plastic, then wax, then more plastic. Waterproof. Airtight. Undetectable by dogs. Then insert those packages into the bodies. Not in the coffin. Not in the lining. Inside the actual bodies. A small incision in the abdominal cavity. Packages placed inside. Soon shut with professional-grade sutures. The body embalmed as normal, formaldehyde masking any residual scent. Dressed. Placed in a coffin. Ready for transport. But here's where it gets more sinister. He didn't just use bodies already scheduled for burial. He started creating his own inventory. Homeless people who died on the streets. Unclaimed bodies at the morgue. People with no families, no one to ask questions. He had connections at the coroner's office. Men he paid to look the other way, to release unclaimed bodies to his funeral home instead of county burial. These bodies became his drug mules, stored in refrigeration units until needed. Then processed, loaded, and shipped. And the destinations weren't just other cities. They were other funeral homes. He built a network across New York, Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore, each one owned or controlled by someone on his payroll, each one a distribution point, each one a place where a coffin could arrive, be buried, and then exhumed later to retrieve the product. Because here's the genius. You don't even need to move the drugs out of the cemetery. You can bury them. In a coffin, in a grave, 6 feet under. And when your buyer is ready, you dig them up. Who's going to notice one more grave? Who's going to question a funeral director who says he needs to relocate a body? The system was perfect, and by 1973, he was moving more heroin through funeral homes than most dealers moved through the streets. The money was staggering. A single kilo purchased for $5,000 in Southeast Asia sold for $50,000 on the street, and he was moving 50, 60, 70 kilos a month. $3 million a month, $36 million a year. In 1973, the equivalent of over $200 million today, and almost none of it was ever detected. Because who searches a funeral procession? Who stops a hearse? Who questions a man in a black suit standing over a coffin? Nobody. And for 4 years, from 1969 to 1973, he operated with complete impunity. The police had no idea. The FBI had no idea. The DEA had no idea. They were looking in the wrong places, watching the streets, watching the projects, watching the corners. And he was burying his product 6 feet under. Let's break down exactly how this operation worked. Because the sophistication is what makes this story truly terrifying. Step 1. Acquisition. He needed bodies that wouldn't be missed. His primary source was the city morgue. Philadelphia had unclaimed bodies. Homeless people, John does. People who died alone with no identification, no family, no one to claim them. By law, these bodies were supposed to be buried in potter's fields, mass graves for the poor and unknown. But he had a man on the inside, a clerk at the morgue who processed the paperwork. For $500 per body, This clerk would misfile the paperwork. The body marked as claimed by a distant relative, released to his funeral home for private burial, and the body would disappear into his system, never to be seen again. Step 2. Processing. The bodies arrived at his funeral home in the middle of the night, delivered by a van with tinted windows, the same van that delivered bodies from hospitals and nursing homes. Nothing unusual. In the basement, his team went to work. The body placed on the embalming table, a standard Y incision made, internal organs removed and discarded, and in their place, the heroin inserted, professionally packaged, multiple layers of vacuum-sealed plastic. Then a layer of wax, then another layer of plastic. Each package weighed exactly 1 kilo. A body could hold between 5 and 10 kilos. The incision sutured closed with surgical precision. The body embalmed as normal, formaldehyde flooding the tissues, masking any scent, then dressed, placed in a coffin, stored in the refrigeration unit until transport. Step 3. Transport. This was where the real genius showed. He used the entire funeral infrastructure. Death certificates, burial permits, transit permits. Every document a funeral home needs to move a body across state lines he had. Legitimate, properly filed, properly stamped. Because he was a legitimate funeral director, he had the licenses, the certifications, the professional standing. When a hearse crossed from Pennsylvania into New York, carrying a coffin with a body inside, border agents didn't search it. They waved it through. Because that's what you do with funeral processions. You show respect. You don't search the dead. And even if they had searched, even if they had opened that coffin, lifted that body, cut those sutures, the packaging was designed to defeat drug-sniffing dogs. The wax layer, the formaldehyde, the multiple seals. A dog might alert to something, but what? The body itself? The embalming fluid? There was no way to prove the drugs were there without a full autopsy. And nobody autopsies a body in transit to a funeral. Step 4. Distribution. The coffin arrived at the destination funeral home, one of his network affiliates. There, the body would be prepared for burial, which meant the heroin was extracted in the same basement using the same methods. The body was then actually buried in a real cemetery, in a real grave, with a real headstone. Because the best cover is the truth. The body was real. The death was real. The funeral was real. The only thing that wasn't real was what was inside the body. And once the heroin was extracted, it was distributed to street-level dealers through normal channels. Cash came back the same way, hidden in coffins. Inside bodies driven back to Philadelphia. The circle was complete, and the money flowed like water. But here's where it gets even darker. He didn't just use unclaimed bodies. He started using bodies that did have families, bodies scheduled for real funerals, real burials, real grieving families who had no idea their loved one was being used as a drug mule. He would approach the family, always with sympathy, always with compassion, and offer a special service. A private viewing, a closed casket ceremony, to preserve your loved one's dignity, he would say. And the family, grateful for his kindness, would agree. The casket would never be opened, the body would never be seen, and inside the heroin would be inserted, transported, and extracted before burial. The family would bury their loved one, never knowing the body had been violated, used, desecrated in the most profound way possible. This wasn't just drug trafficking. This was a violation of the sacred, a desecration of the dead. And it went on for years. By 1974, the heroin epidemic in Philadelphia had reached catastrophic levels. The city had the highest overdose rate in the country. The morgue was overflowing. Emergency rooms were drowning, and police were under enormous pressure to do something. But they were looking in the wrong places, raiding street corners, arresting low-level dealers, confiscating dime bags and needles. And the real supply, the pipeline bringing pure heroin into the city, was rolling right past them in hearses. It wasn't until 1975 that someone finally noticed. A state trooper in New Jersey, working a routine roadblock on the turnpike, flagged down a hearse for random inspection. The driver, One of the Undertaker's employees panicked. He ran the roadblock, crashed the hearse into a ditch, and when police opened the coffin, they found a body, dressed in a suit, hands folded, eyes closed, peaceful. But something was wrong. The body was cold, too cold, the refrigeration unit set to maximum, and when they checked the death certificate, the dates didn't match. The body had been dead for 3 weeks, but the death certificate was dated 2 days ago. The trooper called the coroner. The coroner examined the body and found the incision, fresh sutures, and inside 5 kilos of pure heroin. The case should have exploded, should have been front-page news, should have brought the whole operation down. But here's where the system failure kicks in. The driver was arrested, charged with drug trafficking, but he didn't talk. He had a family. He had been paid, and he knew what happened to people who talked. He took the fall, claimed he was acting alone, claimed he had found the body and decided to use it to move drugs. A one-time thing, a stupid mistake, and the case died there. The Undertaker's name never came up. His funeral home was never searched. The investigation was closed, and he learned from the close call, tightened his operation, changed routes, started using more funeral homes, smaller shipments, more frequent runs. The system adapted, and the drugs kept flowing. But the close call had attracted attention, not from local police, they were still clueless, but from the federal government. The DEA, established in 1973, was starting to get its footing, and they had noticed something strange about Philadelphia's heroin supply. Too pure, too consistent, too well distributed. Street-level dealers were getting product that had clearly come from a single, highly organized source. But no matter how many dealers they arrested, they couldn't find the pipeline. The drugs just kept coming. In 1976, the DEA launched a task force, Operation Graveyard. They didn't know about the funeral homes yet, didn't know about the bodies, but they knew something was wrong with Philadelphia's funeral industry. Too many unclaimed bodies going to private funerals, too many death certificates with suspicious causes, too much money flowing through small funeral homes that should have been struggling. They started watching, following hearses, checking death certificates against morgue records, and slowly, painfully, the pattern began to emerge. The same funeral home, the same network of affiliated homes, the same drivers, the same routes, the same everything. But they still didn't have proof, because you can't arrest someone for driving a hearse, can't arrest someone for burying a body, and you can't search every coffin in America. The investigation stalled until 1977, when an informant came forward, a mortician, one of the Undertaker's employees, a man who had processed bodies for 3 years, who had inserted heroin into 100 corpses, who had seen things that haunted his dreams, and who had finally reached his breaking point. He walked into the DEA office in Philadelphia with a story that sounded like fiction. Bodies used as drug mules, funeral homes as distribution centers, coroners on the payroll, cemeteries as storage facilities. The agents didn't believe him at first, thought he was crazy, or a con artist, or both. But he had details, names, dates, addresses, and most importantly, he had proof. Photographs, taken in the basement of the funeral home, bodies on embalming tables, packages of heroin, the whole operation, documented on film. The DEA finally had what they needed, a warrant, and on March 14, 1977, they raided the funeral home. What they found would shock even the most hardened agents. The basement was a processing center. Embalming equipment, surgical tools, packaging materials, and heroin, 50 kilos of it, hidden in a false wall behind the embalming table. But the real horror was upstairs, in the refrigeration unit, 12 bodies, unclaimed, unidentified, each one a potential drug mule, each one a human being who had died alone and been turned into cargo. The agents called the coroner. The coroner called the medical examiner. And the investigation that followed would uncover one of the most disturbing drug operations in American history. The raid should have been the end of it. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, the photographs damning. But the Undertaker didn't go down easy. He had spent 8 years building a network that included lawyers, politicians, police officers, and coroners. Men who owed him favors, men who had taken his money, men who had looked the other way while he desecrated the dead, and now those men went to work. The first problem was the bodies. 12 unclaimed bodies in his refrigeration unit, but no drugs inside them. The heroin had been extracted the day before the raid. Someone had tipped him off. The 50 kilos in the false wall were enough for a trafficking charge, but not enough to prove the full scope of the operation, not enough to prove he had been using bodies as mules for 8 years. The mortician who had informed, his testimony was crucial. But he was a single witness, a co-conspirator, a man who had participated in the crimes he was describing. His credibility would be shredded in court. And then the bodies started disappearing, not literally, but legally. The coroner who had been releasing unclaimed bodies to the funeral home, he suddenly couldn't find the paperwork. The records were lost. The morgue clerk who had been taking bribes, he retired, moved to Florida, refused to testify. One by one, the witnesses evaporated. One by one, the evidence disappeared. One by one, the case against the Undertaker crumbled. But the DEA wasn't giving up. They had the 50 kilos. They had the photographs. They had the informant. And they had something else, the affiliated funeral homes, the network he had built across 5 states. The DEA raided them all. Simultaneously, New York, Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore, and in each one they found the same thing. Processing centers in the basements, heroin hidden in walls, bodies in refrigeration units. The network was bigger than anyone had imagined. 15 funeral homes, 40 employees. A distribution system that had moved an estimated 2,000 kilos of heroin over 8 years. A street value of over $100 million. In 1977, the case became national news. Funeral home drug ring busted. Heroin hidden in dead bodies. The Undertaker's empire falls. But even as the headlines screamed, the legal battle was just beginning. The Undertaker hired the best defense attorney in Philadelphia. A man who had never lost a federal case. A man who understood that the key to winning wasn't disproving the evidence. It was destroying the witnesses. And he went to work. The mortician informant was portrayed as a drug addict, a liar. A man who had cut deals with the DEA to save himself. The photographs were questioned. Were they staged? Taken out of context? Could they be proven to show what the prosecution claimed? The 50 kilos of heroin, could it be proven that it belonged to the Undertaker? Or could it have been planted by the DEA? The defense attorney didn't need to prove innocence. He just needed to create doubt, and he was very, very good at creating doubt. The trial began in September 1977, 6 months after the raid. 6 months of headlines, of public outrage, of families discovering their loved ones might have been used as drug mules. The courtroom was packed every day. The prosecution presented its case. The defense tore it apart. Witness after witness was discredited. Evidence after evidence was questioned, and slowly the case that had seemed like a slam dunk started to look shaky. But then, something unexpected happened. A woman came forward, the daughter of one of the unclaimed bodies found in the refrigeration unit. A woman who had been searching for her father for 3 years. A homeless man who had disappeared, who she had reported missing to the police, who she had never stopped looking for, and she had proof, a police report, a missing person file, documentation that her father had been alive, had been reported missing, and had somehow ended up dead in a funeral home's refrigeration unit, with no death certificate, no cause of death, and no record of how he got there. The defense attorney tried to discredit her too. But she wasn't a drug addict, wasn't a criminal. She was a schoolteacher, a mother of 2, a woman who had spent 3 years searching for her father, and her testimony broke the case wide open. Because if one unclaimed body was actually a missing person, if one John Doe was actually someone's father, someone's husband, someone's son, then how many others were the same? How many of the unclaimed bodies had been claimed? How many had been stolen from the morgue? How many families had buried empty coffins while their loved ones were being used as drug mules? The jury deliberated for 4 days, and on October 3, 1977, they returned a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Drug trafficking, conspiracy, desecration of human remains. The Undertaker was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison, the maximum allowed by law, and as he was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, the daughter of the missing man stood in the gallery. She didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She just watched. And in her eyes was something that no verdict could give her. The knowledge that her father had been found, that his body had been returned to her, that he would finally be buried with dignity, not as cargo, not as a mule, but as a human being. The Undertaker's conviction sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. Not because he had been caught, drug lords get caught all the time, but because of what he had done. The drug trade has always been violent, always been cruel, always been destructive. But there are lines that even criminals don't cross, lines that separate the business of crime from the realm of the unforgivable. And the Undertaker had crossed every single one of them. In prison, he was a marked man. Not by the guards, by the other inmates. Because even murderers, even rapists, even the worst of the worst, they have mothers. They have fathers. They have people they love. And the idea of desecrating the dead, of violating the sacred space of death, of turning a human body into cargo, it was too much, even for them. He spent his first year in solitary confinement, not by choice, for protection. Because every time he was in general population, someone tried to kill him, a shank in the shower, a beating in the yard, poison in his food. He survived them all, but he never walked freely again. He died in prison in 1994, 17 years into his 40-year sentence. Heart attack. Or so the official report said. The inmates had other theories, but nobody cared enough to investigate. The funeral homes in his network were shut down, the employees arrested, the coroners and morgue clerks who had been on his payroll. Some were prosecuted, most weren't. The system protected its own, and the bodies, the unclaimed, the unidentified, the missing, were finally buried, properly, with dignity, with headstones that bore their names, or unknown, or John Doe. But at least they were buried as human beings, not as cargo, not as mules. The case changed the funeral industry forever. New regulations were passed, stricter oversight of unclaimed bodies, mandatory identification procedures, background checks for funeral directors, the system that had allowed the Undertaker to operate, the system of trust, of respect, of invisibility that surrounded the funeral industry, was dismantled, and in its place came something else, something colder, more bureaucratic, more suspicious. The funeral industry never fully recovered from the scandal, and neither did the families who discovered their loved ones had been violated. The daughter of the missing man, the school teacher who had broken the case, she never stopped advocating for stricter laws, for better oversight, for the dignity of the dead. She founded an organization, the Dignity Project, dedicated to ensuring that no one else would ever suffer what her father had suffered, what thousands of others had suffered. The organization still exists today. A small office in Philadelphia, run by volunteers, funded by donations, and every year on the anniversary of the verdict, they hold a memorial for the unknown, for the unclaimed, for the forgotten. The names are read aloud, the candles are lit, and the dead are remembered, not as victims of a drug empire, but as human beings, as fathers, as mothers, as sons and daughters, as people who deserved better. The Undertaker's empire is long gone, but the scars remain. In the funeral industry, in the families, in the collective memory of a city that learned, the hard way, that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it wears a black suit. Sometimes it drives a hearse. Sometimes it stands at a graveside with its head bowed, offering comfort to the grieving. And sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who hide in plain sight. The ones who use our trust against us. The ones who turn our most sacred rituals into weapons. The ones who prove that in the war on drugs, the real casualties aren't just the living. They're the dead. This is the kind of story that makes you question everything. The systems we trust, the people we respect, the rituals we hold sacred. Because if a man can build $100 million drug empire inside funeral homes, using dead bodies as mules, then what else is possible? What other horrors are hiding in plain sight? What other systems are being exploited while we look the other way? The Undertaker wasn't a genius, wasn't a mastermind. He was a man who saw a gap in the system and exploited it. A gap that existed because we, as a society, chose not to look too closely at the things that make us uncomfortable. Death. The funeral industry. The handling of the dead. We look away because it's easier. Because it's painful. Because we don't want to think about it. And that's exactly what predators like the Undertaker count on. They count on our silence, our avoidance, our willingness to trust without questioning, and they use that trust to destroy us. If this story shook you, if it made you think, if it made you angry, good, it should. And if you want more stories like this, stories that expose the dark underbelly of American crime, stories that make you question everything you thought you knew, subscribe to TA Stories. Hit the notification bell, because we're just getting started. The next story, it's even darker, even more twisted, and it's coming soon. Until then, stay sharp, stay questioning. And never forget, the most dangerous monsters are the ones who look exactly like us.